The Scars of Eden, Chapter 10. We have been here before. Kazakhstan, 2013. It is not about aliens. Maxim Makakov is negotiating the buzz of media attention and spin following the publication of his cutting-edge research in the science journal Icarus. The research in question has been the collaboration of Maxim and Vladimir Sherbak of the Fesenkov Astrophysical Institute and the Al-Farabi Kazakh National University of Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan is an enormous country. In fact, it is the largest landlocked country in the world. Yet it is not often on the front pages of the Western press. However, Makakov and Sherbak's research has it in the headlines, and the implications of what they have found are groundbreaking. To give you an idea, the 1997 movie Contact, written as a novel by astrophysicist Carl Sagan, was based on the idea that a benevolent neighboring civilization might send a signal to planet Earth, embedded with non-random mathematical patterns as a way of cluing the receivers that the source of the broadcast is an extraterrestrial intelligence. Makakov and Sherbak argued that their findings demonstrate beyond reasonable doubt that just such a signal has already been sent. It's embedded in our genetic code. Coming only 4 years after the Vatican's invitation to embrace a brother or sister alien, the newspapers are all over it. Some leap upon Makakov and Sherbak's paper as proof of God and creationism. Others claim it as proof of aliens and evolution. To my surprise, the media are positive, even with a raised eyebrow or two, as they applaud the courage of these two Kazakh scientists who apparently have spent 13 years studying the human genome. This last detail, however, turns out not to be true. Canberra, Australia, August 2020. Makakov and Sherbak did not work on the human genome, not even for a year, let alone 13, as I have read in countless newspaper reports at the time. This is why in 2020 I have taken my questions directly to the source, cap in hand, to sit at the feet of Maxim Makakov himself and listen firsthand to what he and his collaborator Vladimir Sherbak actually intended in that flurry of excitement now 7 years ago. The signal sits in the genetic code, Maxim explains, which is something very different from the genome. This means that all life on Earth would owe a debt to the Seeders, who Maxim identifies very precisely as a parent civilization, an ET intelligence, not aliens. The very word aliens is a misnomer, he says, since the senders and the seed's descendants share common cellular ancestry. My ears prick up when I hear this. Maxim's very precise language echoes of the points made by Reverend Dr. Guy Casamagano at the time of the colloquium back in 2009. He too emphasized that we should not use the term aliens when talking about our cosmic neighbors. After all, he said, we would be creatures of the same creation, children of the same Heavenly Father. Maxim is making the same point, though not on the basis of theology. He is speaking purely about what he and his collaborator observed in the mathematical patterns of our genetic coding. He even has an idea of what mechanism might have been used to spread the seeds of life through our galaxy. Seeding star-forming proto-clusters, he says, might be more efficient than seeding individual planets. If that was the case, it is likely that the stars which were born in the same cluster the sun was born in might host life as well. In my mind, this conjures up a vision of the Star Trek universe in which the United Federation of Planets brings together a range of species who for the most part look suspiciously similar to one another. Upright, 2 legs, 2 arms, a neck, and a head with a pair of eyes, a pair of ears, a mouth, and a pair of nostrils. I have always assumed this similarity was a function of budgetary constraints for costumes and makeup at the Desilu studio. What Maxim is saying hints at a real-world scenario. So Maxim, if at a cellular level we're related to all life forms on planets orbiting related stars, how recognizable would we expect our genetic relatives to be? That's a tough question, he answers, if they had evolved to some higher forms at all. Currently there is no answer, only intuitive guesses. Still, I would note that many evolutionary biologists now consider convergent evolution as a major player. Under this view, it becomes likely that our intelligent cosmic relatives might not be very different to us as per appearance. Convergent evolution is the theory that the same genetic coding will lead ultimately to similar creatures for similar niches. As a citizen of Australia, I see the outcome of convergent evolution around me all the time. For instance, Australia has no groundhogs. We have wombats, the more excellent marsupial version. Groundhogs and wombats are not related. They have just developed a somewhat similar form for a similar niche. In Australia, we have no indigenous dogs, but until 1938, what we did have was the Tasmanian tiger, which, to the untrained eye, was a dog-sized carnivore, indistinguishable from a dog, except it wasn't. It was a marsupial. For another example, we have Tasmanian devils in the place of wolverines, echidnas in the place of porcupines, and instead of flying squirrels, we have sugar gliders. I could go on. In a way, Australia provides a good Earth-based illustration of what might happen if the same genetic seeding that landed on planet Earth were to land on a planet with similar conditions. For that reason, perhaps, we should not be surprised if interstellar neighbors should turn up looking rather human. Essentially, what Makokov and Shcherbak's findings have done is put flesh on the bones of a theory which was championed by Francis Crick, the Nobel Prize-winning co-discoverer of the double helix of DNA. Among other eminent scientists and DNA researchers, Francis Crick argued that all life on Earth was ultimately of extraterrestrial origin, and that the genetic code for conscious, intelligent life was deliberately seeded throughout at least this part of the cosmos. I am rather skeptical, Maxim says, about the possibility of ET intervention into terrestrial evolution, all those parallels in ancient scripts notwithstanding. I do not say this is ruled out completely. If I understand Maxim correctly, the purpose of the non-random code sent out to seed the cosmos was to ensure a continuation and spreading of not merely life, but specifically life with consciousness and intelligence, what Maxim describes as intelligence plus experience. It adds to my experience, he says, the knowledge that there existed a technology-oriented culture elsewhere before even Earth was formed. Maxim's language is emphatically precise, carefully keeping clear blue water between objective findings and any personal speculation. But I am eager to see if I can draw another therefore from our conversation. Maxim, if an ET intelligence engineered the code that seeded planet Earth, does that mean that our genetic coding is showing us a snapshot in a chain of old civilizations seeding new civilizations? Have you found anything that would indicate a 0 point or an ultimate source, given that our universe appears to have a finite beginning? No, he says. Nothing we found indicates a chain, although it also does not preclude it. My personal educated guess, based on available astrophysical data, is that we are the second in the series. It is largely more probable that our direct ancestors were the 0 point, rather than they also had descended from seeding. I am grateful to Maxim for his courage and precision, making a mental note that the arrival of this genetic coding on Earth may have seeded terrestrial civilizations long before anything we know about. As for what we do know about terrestrial civilization, most school textbooks point to the Epic of Gilgamesh as the oldest narrative of the Earth's oldest known civilization. However, it is clear from the very text itself that the Epic of Gilgamesh is quoting a story from a source even more ancient than itself. Southeast Turkey is one place that hints at the possibility of a relay of successive civilizations on planet Earth. In 1998, the University of Norway of Applied Sciences and the Max Planck Institute of Cologne, Germany, sent a team led by Professor Manfred Huhn to the mountain region of Karakadag in southeast Turkey. There they explored the surviving evidence of a world-changing technology from the time of the last ice age. In the tipping point of human history, as the ice sheets receded, one tribe, or even one family, as Manfred Huhn suggested, made a discovery that was to be the seed of our civilization. They learned to farm. Farms produce surpluses. Surpluses produce social specialization. From this flows the ability to develop complex, stable societies and to build cities to house them. It was the incredible leap forward. To give you a sense of scale, let me tell you that I used to live on the farm in southeast Australia where William Farrar famously created Federation wheat. At the end of the 19th century, urban Australia desperately needed a form of wheat which could reliably generate large crops season after season in the harsh conditions of the Australian climate. William Farrar was a scientist and the son of a farmer. With a lifelong knowledge of farming and all the advantages of 19th century science, Farrar was able to genetically modify strains of wheat until he had a plant which could be cultivated as a crop in Australian soil. To make that modification, it took him 20 years. The family of 10,000 years ago, identified by Manfred Hume's research, had to do what Farrar did 11 times over to turn the naturally occurring plants they adapted into cultivatable crops. Somehow, the agricultural science pioneered by the enigmatic family then spread, which it did rapidly, all around the planet. Clearly, we must be looking at a very talented family because, as well as working out how to genetically modify those 11 crops, they also learned the art of animal husbandry. Manfred Hume's team has given the world a lot to think about. Curiously, the remnants of an even earlier epoch can be found just a few hours down the road from Karakadag. Göbekli Tepe is a sophisticated megalithic site, perhaps 50 times the size of Stonehenge, once fully excavated. Carvings in the rock hint at astronomical expertise and international connections with other ancient sites. The structures are estimated at 10,000 years of age. Even more curiously, the site at Göbekli Tepe appears to have been very carefully buried as a means of preservation around 8,000 years ago. Don't miss those dates. In locations within hours of each other in ancient southeast Turkey, it appears that we are witnessing the end of one megalithic culture and the beginnings of another. The proximity of time and place makes me wonder if the family at Karakadag may have had a little assistance from their forebears at Göbekli Tepe in the process of seeding today's civilization. The oral history of the Mohican people of the upper Hudson River Valley tells of exactly this kind of outside assistance. Their story speaks of a time long ago when some kind of catastrophe had forced their ancestors into higher, less hospitable terrain. In this harsh and unfamiliar territory, their ability to survive was suddenly uncertain. The Mohican people credit their survival to the sudden appearance of certain mysterious others, who coached them in the technologies which would enable them to weather the change, feed and medicate themselves, and make it through for a more prosperous future. I wonder if our friends at Karakadag may have benefited from a similar intervention when their own survival hung in the balance. While a relay of terrestrial civilizations might not be too hard to imagine, some may find it a stretch to accommodate Makukov and Shushurbeck's model of an interstellar relay. Yet that idea too resides in our Aboriginal stories. Whether sitting at the feet of the Dogon people of Mali, West Africa, listening to their stories of the Sirius star system, or sitting at the feet of the Efik people of Nigeria as they tell their story of Abasi and Atai, we are soaking in a story of interstellar seeding which goes back thousands of years. The Zulu people also have their story of life arriving on Earth from outer space. Umkulukulu, the first human, lands on the planet's surface, along with every living creature in seed form. The new arrivals develop in seed pods on Earth's fertile soil, until ready to burst out on the planet's surface. It is a wonderfully cinematic version of panspermia. Clearly, the idea of an intergalactic parent civilization is not new. If we can accept it, we are not the first civilization, neither in space nor on our own planet. We are perhaps only the latest of many. My reading of Genesis suggests that by the time we reach the end of the stories of beginnings, Genesis 1 through 11, we have the recollection of possibly three different resets of civilization on a global scale. 1. In Genesis 1 and 2, the planet is terraformed following a catastrophe which has flooded the planet and shrouded it in darkness. 2. Genesis 6 tells the story of a flood of extinction-level proportions. Those who populated the planet prior to the flood lived lives many times the lifespan of the human species that followed post-flood. This is a detail repeated from the Sumerian accounts. 3. Genesis 11 speaks of an attack on the technological human civilization, so profound that the survivors had to re-evolve the faculty of speech. It is possible that these three narratives offer different recollections of the same planetary reboot, or they could be the memories of three different cataclysms. Whichever it is, some traumatic memory has been scarred into the fabric of Genesis to show that we are not the first civilization on Earth, and we have known it for a long time. Neither are we the first technological people to have graced this planet. Reading Genesis and the Sumerian cuneiforms alongside one another reveals that the technology attacked in the Babel narrative is spacefaring technology. Etymologically, the word Babel means gateway for the powerful ones. The Genesis account describes the function of Babel's towering structure as a bridge to the heavens. The Sumerian text tells us that from this structure, 50 technicians dispatched 300 observers to their stations in the stars, what we would call space stations. These narratives, alongside Indian Vedas and carvings around the world, tell us that Earth has been home to spacefarers before. Now, in the 21st century, images of anomalous artifacts on the surface of Mars are raising the possibility that when we finally land a manned mission on its surface, we will not be the first civilization to tread the soil of our planetary neighbor. If we take our world mythologies as vehicles of ancient memory, such a find on the red planet need not surprise us. Back on Earth, archaeological finds continue to reveal an unacknowledged past on our own planet. Off the coast of India, Japan, Malta, and Cuba, and up to under 36 meters of ocean, lie the megalithic remains of cities which would have been above sea level no more recently than 10,000 years ago. Yet somehow, our school textbooks still report that civilization began no more than 7,500 years ago in the Fertile Crescent. Today, archaeological voices are increasingly telling us there was a civilization before. New technologies such as ground-penetrating radar and soil magnetization analysis are revealing the presence of forgotten cities buried beneath the jungles of Cambodia and Amazonia. These are not prehistoric cities. Indeed, their zenith was during the Common Era. Yet until the last few years, nature has kept them hidden from sight, demonstrating just how quickly the signs of megalithic civilizations can disappear from view. For instance, when Machu Picchu in the Peruvian Andes was photographed in 1915, not much more could be seen than a massive jungle. 70 years later, excavations revealed the beautiful megalithic remains of the ancient Inca, whose culture spread across the Andes of South America and into Central America. In 1977, the Dutch anthropologist Maria Scholten published her work, La Ruta de Viracocha. Her work demonstrated the sophistication of the megalithic cultures of the Andes and pointed to evidence suggesting an even older mother culture, which predated and connected them all. The design of Tiahuanaco speaks of advanced city planning in alignment with the stars, and the phenomenal fluid engineering of stone, Excehuman, at Cusco has become a byword for mystifying and awe-inspiring skills lost to today's civil engineers. Maria Scholten's work demonstrated that the major Incan cities of Tiahuanaco, Pucará, Cusco, Ollantaytambo, Machu Picchu, and Cajamarca were constructed at precise intervals along a northwest to southeast vector, which sits on an exact bearing of 45 degrees from north-south axis. The ability of ancient city builders to coordinate construction so accurately between sites across a 1,500-kilometer vector through the Andean mountains and what today are separate countries is absolutely mind-boggling. Furthermore, the axis, called the Ruta Viracocha, not only joins the cities themselves, but runs precisely through the diagonals of the major temples of each city, perfectly intersecting them. Maria Shelton was able to identify the unit of measurement employed by this forgotten Andean mother culture. The Andean unit was 3.34 times the units of today's metric system. The unit for cloth and ceramics was 3.34 centimeters. For the buildings, it was 3.34 meters. For distance, it was 3.34 kilometers. The significance of this correlation is that it confirms for us that the Andean mother culture based its system of measurement on the size of the planet, something that our civilization didn't do until 1795. The Andean unit was based on 1/30th of a millionth of the distance from the equator to the pole. Evidently, the Andean mother culture knew how to measure the size of the planet. Furthermore, the alignment of the cities and structures throughout the Ruta de Viracocha demonstrates precise alignments with the stars of the Milky Way. This would suggest that the highly developed astronomical knowledge for which the Incan people are renowned actually goes back to the Andean mother culture, the civilization that came before. The descendants of the Inca of Cusco tell a story about the origins of the mother culture. Their story was relayed to Spanish linguist Juan Diaz de Betanzos in the 1550s. His narrative of the Incas described a powerful being called Viracocha, whose intervention in the story of planet Earth parallels many of the elements of the Popol Vuh and the stories of Kukulkan, Quetzalcoatl, Quetzalcoatl. Viracocha also emerges in that mysterious epic when planet Earth is shrouded in darkness. He too dislikes his early attempts at generating suitable Homo sapiens. Just like the engineers of the Mayan story, Viracocha genocides his failed attempts at humanity with a devastating flood. The narrative of the Incas goes further, though, and credits Viracocha not only with the final engineering of Homo sapiens, but also with humanity's basic education in agriculture, medicine, engineering, and all the basics of city-based civilization. At the same time, certain aspects of the Incan account as reported by De Betanzos appear to have fused the figure of Viracocha, who first appears over the waters like Lake Titicaca, with the cosmic figure of Saturn, thus associating Viracocha with a powerful cosmic deity figure. In 1907, another Spanish scholar, Pedro Sarmiento de Gamboa, relayed the stories told to him by the people of Cusco. According to de Gamboa's version of events, Viracocha, although known as the creator, arrived on an already existing South America, albeit one shrouded in darkness and in need of light and terraforming. Significantly, Viracocha was described in this account as being a man of medium height with light skin. He carried a book of wisdom, wore white garments, and walked with a staff. Not quite the cosmic god-like figure one might have expected. Sadly, this indigenous recollection of Viracocha's appearance may have left Incan descendants rather vulnerable to the claims of the Catholic forces who invaded in the 15th and 16th centuries. The European invaders brought a book of sacred wisdom, and they were endowed with light skin. Their officers dressed in white garments and carried staffs which fired bullets. The correlations were so obvious that when Francisco Pizarro landed on the Peruvian coast at San Mateo Bay in 1532, the locals took the conquistador to be Viracocha himself, finally returned, a fortunate for him confusion. The Catholic educators quickly decided to reaffirm the well-established mythology of Viracocha and assimilate it to the Christian story as a way of annexing the people's existing religious loyalties. It was easy to recognize similarities between the Andean stories of Viracocha with the Bible stories of beginnings. The biblical story could piggyback quite nicely on a story the locals already believed. It was a convenient way to fast-track the people's evangelization to assert that Viracocha was God. The theological sleight of hand shown in this historic moment provides us with a powerful object lesson. In exactly the same way that the Bible's redactors equated God with the Elohim and so credited God with all the violence and brutality of the powerful ones, so the Spanish missionaries of the 16th century equated God with Viracocha, and in so doing, credited the Christian God with the genocide of the people's ancestors, memorialized in the Incan narratives. This confusion anchored the idea of a violent God who could not be questioned, an image helpful to invaders sporting both Bibles and guns. At the same time, the equation of Viracocha with God obscured the pointy question of precisely what kind of entity Viracocha really was. The effects would be far-reaching. Think about what happens to the heart and mind of a child brought up in the home of an abusive, violent, alcoholic parent, a parent who has to be appeased and tiptoed around. It eviscerates the child's happiness and self-esteem. To the extent that we have bought into a universe that equates God with a violent, genociding entity who cannot be questioned, we have placed the whole of humanity in such a household. You have to wonder what that equation has done to the psychology of human beings. This is why confusing God with other entities, whether Viracocha, the Elohim, the Sky People, or the engineers, is such a critical error. If we look back to the history that preceded this unfortunate moment of confusion, it is fascinating to see that the Inca people clearly affirmed an external intervention by a non-human entity as their way of accounting for their ancestors' intelligence and facility with the basic technologies of society. Just as the proximity of Göbekli Tepe to Karakodag within southeast Turkey hints at the possibility of a previous culture assisting a new one, so the ancient peoples of the Andes attest to the advancement of a previous civilization with roots off-planet. Plato argued that Earth has been home to a succession of civilizations. From Egyptian sources, he became convinced that the movement of objects in space impact planet Earth on average once every 5,000 years, each time taking civilization on Earth down to a virtual zero. The testimonies of the Andes, of southeast Turkey, and the lost cities of our coastal waters would also suggest that Plato was onto something. What if the story of planetary reboots go even further back into geological timescales? If civilizations preceded us by geological time frames, how could we possibly know? Genesis 11 hints at a time when the earth had a single landmass and a single coastline. Genesis 10 names the generation of Peleg as the time when Earth's continents first separated. Similarly, there is an Australian Aboriginal story of the separation of Australia and India. By today's reckoning, the timeline of Homo sapiens extends only 200,000 years into our history, well outside the time frame of such geological adventures. However, it is not impossible to imagine that civilization on Earth may have a longer and more interesting story than anything we have been able to dig up. After all, if there were a technological species thriving on planet Earth long before us, long before the dinosaurs, before the Cambrian explosion, by now all the material evidence of such a society would be compressed within a few millimeters of minerals in the rocky sediments of our planet. Absent of another source of information, we simply wouldn't know. As to the story of our civilization, the many conflicts among empires competing for territory and the warfare between colonizers and indigenous peoples have all left deep scars in the soul of our current civilization. Indeed, the competition of cultures is as alive today as ever. What lies at the heart of these conflicts? The oldest continual culture on planet Earth is that of Australia's Aboriginal peoples. Their closest relatives, according to the latest DNA research, are the Native Americans of South, Central, and North America. And there are fascinating cultural parallels in their respective ways of living in harmony with the land. Like their Native American cousins, Aboriginal Australians speak of visitors from the Pleiades and credit them with their ancestors' tuition. The Aboriginal presence on Australian soil is understood to go back more than 60,000 years. So, theirs is surely our supreme story of living sustainably on this planet. The intervention that created farming in southeast Turkey 10,000 years ago has a different aspect. It begins with the modification of genes in a naturally occurring grass to turn it into wheat for cultivation on a massive scale. Karakadag initiated a model of farming which would lead to specialized society, city living, and ultimately to the industrialization of food and farming. The story of Australia dramatizes the difference between these two agricultural interventions. British Australia needed William Farrar's Federation wheat, a genetic adaptation in the tradition of Karakadag, in order to support cities on a European scale. Meanwhile, Aboriginal Australians have been living on the land quite comfortably and sustainably, using Australia's naturally occurring grasses to make their flour and bread for more than 60,000 years. The two different wheats illustrate two different approaches, two different ways of living on the continent. The location of Karakadag in southeast Turkey hints at the possibility that its lesson in agronomy of 10,000 years ago may have come from the same sources who the Babylonian mythology says provided our Mesopotamian ancestors with their lessons in banking, money, and legal systems, contracts, time measurement, and record keeping. It makes me wonder about today's battles between industrial scale, GM, petrochemical-based farming, typified by corporations like Monsanto, and the traditional approaches of farmers around the world who use natural organic seed and the natural synergies of combination and rotational farming. Are those battles, in reality, the inevitable outcome of two conflicting models of farming, imparted through two quite different interventions in our evolution as a civilization, the most recent 10,000 years ago, just after the most recent planetary catastrophe, and the other after the previous cataclysm more than 60,000 years ago? Are we today caught in a competition of cultures with origins far beyond the world of our earthly ancestors? If our world mythologies genuinely carry an ancestral memory of prehistoric tutors from the stars, I wonder how those ancient visitors must have appeared to have gained such traction with a primitive human population who had never seen them before. What was it about our visitors that would have inspired respect rather than repulsion, admiration rather than pure terror? To answer that question, our journey will take us first to the Levant in the early Iron Age, and from there to an unsettling close encounter in the English city of Chichester. And that is the end of Chapter 10. Peace and blessings to you all.